Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, where we take a hard look at all the major macroeconomic developments in the economy. Today we're going to take a hard look at not just one, but rather the entire gamut of the country's macroeconomic fundamentals, ranging from growth to inflation to trade and the fiscal deficit. And we're going to do it with someone who is widely acknowledged as a maestro in the field of economics, Dr. R Rangarajan. As former Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and then as Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council under the UPA Government, Dr. Rangarajan has an unparalleled understanding of the country's macroeconomic challenges. Welcome to the show, Dr. Rangarajan. Let me start by asking you, the RBI's decision to keep interest rates unchanged in its latest bi-monthly monetary policy statement has earned the governor the epithet of inflation warrior from the Economic Times. You yourself have been called inflation hawk during your time as RBI governor. So is there something about central bank governors that makes them inflation fighters first and foremost?
Well, I think the primary responsibility of the central bank is to maintain price stability, and therefore if the governor of the central bank sounds like an inflation hawk or an inflation warrior, it is quite legitimate. I think there are many objectives before economic policy and monetary policy. Some of them are important, but among the various objectives, the dominant objective as far as the central bank is concerned is to maintain price stability, to maintain inflation at a low level, and therefore we should work towards it. In fact, my own view is that aiming at 8% retail inflation rate by January 2015 seems too liberal. We already have reached a point of 7.3% retail inflation, and therefore we should work towards a much lower level of inflation by January 2015. I think we should get it to about 7% by 2015 so that we can comfortably move to the 6% target in 2016.
Is it realistic to have such an ambitious target given that there's a high likelihood of a subnormal monsoon this year?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we should get to about 7 or close to 7% in by January 2015. We are already at 7.3%, even assuming that this is because of the base effect. Some adjustments will happen during the year, but by January 2015 I don't see why we should not be at the same level as we are now, and then get it by another 1% down by January 2016. Because if you look at it, if you maintain a 6% inflation over a period of time, then you are really going out of alignment. If we have a continuous level of inflation at 6% even, then there is a wide gap, and this will get reflected in our exchange rate. There is no point in saying that the rupee depreciates. This is a consequence of the inflation differential.
But by that logic, would you say there's a case for a rate hike rather than a rate reduction?
A case for raising the rate of interest may not be there, but by maintaining the status quo for some more time may become absolutely essential. The case for hiking the interest rate will come in if the situation really deteriorates and there is a big jump in inflation. I do not see that at this particular moment. What I see at the particular moment is some temporary pressures on food prices in the next few months, and then perhaps quieten down. But so long as headline inflation remains at a fairly high level, the scope or the maneuverability of the central bank in terms of lowering the interest rate does not exist. I would be very cautious about hiking the interest rate, but that will happen only if the inflation really goes completely out of control. But so long as inflation remains around this level, and our objective is to take it down for some time to come, I would believe that the status quo is the most appropriate policy.
Modern central banks have more than one objective, but between the two objectives of price stability and growth, which one do you think should get priority in the present scenario? What weightage would you have given to each if you were the governor today?
Well, as I mentioned, both objectives are desirable in themselves, and as far as growth is concerned, it is the concern not only of the Reserve Bank but also the government and various other agencies. Therefore, the role that monetary policy can play with respect to growth is less than the role that monetary policy can play in terms of containing demand pressures and inflation. Therefore, to go back to your point that I made earlier, both are desirable objectives, but from the point of view of monetary authorities, controlling inflation is more important, because also for the reason that by containing inflation, you will provide the framework for a more sustained higher growth over the medium term. I think the two objectives are not in conflict over the medium term, even though they may sound or they may appear to be conflicting in the short term. Therefore, I would say that if you want to ask me in terms of weights, certainly about 60% weight should go for price stability and 40% for growth.
Well, I'm afraid on that note, we'll have to slip into a very short break, but please do stay with us. After the break, we will be discussing the issue of fiscal and monetary policy coordination in the Indian context. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the macroeconomic fundamentals of the Indian economy. Well, monetary policy in India has always been subservient to fiscal policy. So does that not limit the degrees of freedom available to the Reserve Bank? What is the likelihood that the RBI's plans will go awry because the government is not able to stick to its own fiscal deficit target?
Well, the commitment of the government to a fiscal deficit of 4.1% has been repeated many times. There are a number of policy actions that are needed in order to achieve that fiscal deficit target. A more decisive action plan on subsidies has to be spelled out. Without it, in my view, it will not be possible to get to 4.1% of the GDP as a fiscal deficit. Also, what will happen is that it can also result in some drastic cut in expenditures towards the end, which may not necessarily be the ideal thing. Therefore, I would also think that the government must have an alternative expenditure program in case the revenues do not come up to the level that they have indicated in the budget. Therefore, instead of resorting to ad hoc cuts in expenditure towards the end, an alternative program of expenditure in case the revenues fall short should also be ready. As far as the monetary policy is concerned, for the time being, I think it should work with the idea that the fiscal deficit will be met. But if there are chances that the fiscal deficit will be breached, then a tighter monetary policy will be required. But I believe, taking all factors into account, maintenance of the current stance for some more time would be the most appropriate thing.
Are you happy with the government's efforts in the recent past 2 months that the government has been in office?
Well, there are two things that people talk about. One is sentiment. Yes, in terms of sentiment, in terms of reviving hope, the government has done or taken a number of actions which may aid that. But as far as the concrete thing is concerned, as I mentioned, action is required. For example, one of the documents along with the budget clearly indicates that a decision or a decisive action on the appropriate number of cylinders that should be supplied at subsidized level is required. That's what it says very clearly. But I think, yes, apart from this statement, any a definite policy action on that would have given it greater credibility. Therefore, I think that the government have said all the right things in the last 2 months, both in terms of reviving investment, both in terms of what needs to be done on government expenditure, and therefore we will have to see in the rest of the year how they will take those actions which are needed to implement the ideas.
But how much of the improvement that you're mentioning in the macros is actually for real?
Well, I think on the external front, the improvement is there on the export side also. There is a pickup of export last year by about 4%. In terms of the reduction in the trade deficit of the order of about $45 billion, nearly 50% of that was contributed by the reduction in the gold imports. I believe that going ahead there could be some pickup, but it need not necessarily be high. After all, something like between 30 and 40 billion dollars was the actual import of gold prior to 2011-12. Therefore, that level of import of gold we can absorb. But what has happened was that it jumped from something like 37 billion dollars to 56 billion dollars. That, I believe, is primarily an outcome of high level of inflation and the inadequate return on the financial assets as perceived by the savers. Therefore, going ahead, if we have a control over inflation, I believe that the current account deficit can be maintained at the level of around 2% of the GDP. After the May 22nd, what happened last year was a sudden withdrawal of capital flows. If we talk about 2% of the GDP as the probable level of balance of payments, it comes out somewhere around $40 to $50 billion. Last year, current account deficit was less than $40 billion. Let us say about $40-45 billion is a kind of current account deficit that one is really talking about. And that level of capital inflows is likely to come into the country. I mean, I think that it is only when you get to the current account deficit of the order of $70 billion or $80 billion, you run into severe problem. You remember that in 2012-13 there was something like $88 billion. We did have capital flows in that year, very substantial, and we didn't face a problem. But in the second year, in the following year, certainly we face a problem because of the capital inflows not being adequate. Yes, I agree that the external flows will naturally influence the exchange rate.
Let me shift to the external sector now. The RBI is clearly concerned about the prospect of greater exchange rate volatility in the post-taper world, where US interest rates are bound to rise. What kind of safeguards should the RBI put in place? Is there any ballpark number or rule of thumb to determine how much forex reserves are adequate?
If we have a modest level of current account deficit, which is in the range of $40 to $50 billion, I think that amount of capital flows we can expect. Even if the US were to adopt a more tight policy. One doesn't know exactly what exactly is the optimum level of reserves. Sometimes it is also a perception problem. If the external world perceives that the level of reserves that their central bank has is considered to be adequate, then certain kinds of speculative activities also recede. Therefore, the level of reserves that we now have is reasonable, but it is not as high in terms of the imports 3 or 4 years ago. That is in 2007-8, we had a very, very comfortable level. But something like 4 to 5 months level of imports plus certain amount of repayments that are due, I think this is what is really to be taken into account. I think imports are not the only factor to be taken into account. We also need to take into account some amount of payments that are due, put them together, and about, as I said, about the current level and a little above that level would be adequate normally. But ultimately, if the exchange rate is to be at a reasonable level, and pressures ought to be maintained at a level which is comfortable, then I believe we need to act in a way in which the export competitiveness is maintained, and the imports of certain commodities, or what one might call inessential commodities, are discouraged. Basically, I would say, maybe I'm harping too much on it, controlling inflation is a key thing, because it will not let the real effective exchange rate to rise too much. It will improve the competitiveness of our Indian exports, and it will also enable us to curtail some of the imports.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to slip into another short break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon, and we'll be discussing financial inclusion and public sector banks after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the macroeconomic fundamentals with Dr. C. Rangarajan. To talk of financial inclusion, that's been an act of faith with previous governments as well, and with the present government too. And though they may not have used the term financial inclusion, how do you view the RBI's recent efforts and the government's again to push the pace of financial inclusion by going back to a target-oriented approach, differentiated licenses and so on, things that really haven't worked in the past, but we seem determined to revisit?
The point is that financial development has to happen in many directions. I think the small bank idea, we called it in our time local area bank idea, was developed. I think after the concept was developed, a few licenses were given. Then there was not much interest on the part of the central bank to push that idea. But in the context of financial inclusion, I do believe that the concept of local area banks, which we advocated in 1997, is still useful. But coming back to infrastructure, I have a feeling that perhaps we should go back to the earlier idea of establishing development finance institutions. I do know that in the early years of the reform period, we moved away from it. We thought universal banking will take care of the infrastructure needs also. But the developments in the last few years have clearly indicated that while infrastructure lending by banks have increased, they are facing exposure limits and group limits apart from asset liability mismatch. And the capital market has also not developed, particularly the debt market has not developed to provide adequate capital of long-term nature to the infrastructure industries. Therefore, I would really suggest that whether we should go back to the earlier idea of setting up development banking institutions and development finance institutions with a focus on infrastructure, with a focus on long-term capital, not only infrastructure, long-term capital for manufacturing. The only question that arises there is, earlier on, the Reserve Bank of India used to provide from long-term operations fund credit at a very low rate. Therefore, these institutions were able to mix the low-cost credit from Reserve Bank with what they were able to borrow from the market and make a mix and lend it at a reasonable level for long-term capital. But now that the Reserve Bank of India is now giving away all its profits to the Government of India, the Government of India must now take on itself the responsibility to provide some long-term funds at very low rates of interest to development finance institutions.
Talking now of public sector banks, the recent case of the chairman of a public sector bank being arrested for taking bribes has again turned the spotlight on governance in these banks. Is it a problem of governance that is peculiar to public sector banks, and is that a function of ownership? In which case, what is your response to the NIC committee recommendation on ensuring an arm's length relationship by setting up a bank investment company?
Well, the organization of the public sector banks and the extent to which management becomes accountable are critical issues. The whole process of selection of the chief executives, the manner in which it is done, the process through which it goes, all that needs to be re-examined. I mean, I think whether whether the present procedure that is adopted is the most appropriate thing. And we really need to make the top management accountable. And many people have talked in terms of giving a longer tenure to the bank chairman. Therefore, it is not as if public sector banks cannot function effectively. In fact, in my view, even inducting up to 49% the private shareholding has had the effect of increasing the accountability of the functioning of the banks, because they become accountable to the shareholders other than the government. Therefore, there is the impact on the manner in which they function. Therefore, we need to restructure the boards. We need to ensure that whether the members on the board are the appropriate people. Therefore, a whole lot of things needs to be done in terms of streamlining the board structure, streamlining the selection of the bank chairman, and so on.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have in this edition of Macros with Mythili. Thank you so much, Dr. Rangarajan, for joining us and sharing your views and all the major macroeconomic challenges before us at the moment. Thank you also for watching, but we'll be back next week, same time, with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.